your fields for sclerotinia damage, and it's kind of funny, you get it this time of year and all of a sudden, oh my god, there's a sclerotinia epidemic, and I can't believe what happened kind of thing. So it's pretty interesting how we can sort of forget about a disease like that. But when you're driving around and you see little premature areas that have been starting to ripen, that's a pretty good indication that you probably want to get out of the truck and start trudging through the fields and get a better feel and for what type of disease onset you have, though, because waiting until harvest time, you know, obviously it's a little bit too late to do anything about it. And every year after year, it's pretty amazing. I think maybe a lot of it has to do with we've got a lot of new canola growers out there. There's been, I can't believe how much yellow we've seen in southern Alberta. And you think back a few years ago, canola was sort of, you know, even the big seed companies said, yeah, southern Alberta, there's not much for canola. Look at it now. And the, you know, 3 years of really wet conditions have bring on a big onset of it. So this is actually sclerotinia damage, and it really does weaken the root to the point where it's going to start breaking off. So I'm going to let Ron Howard talk about the disease itself and looking at some different symptomology in the plants.
Great, thanks Ken, and thanks to Farming Smarter for the chance to come here today and talk about diseases. Canola is susceptible to probably about a dozen diseases, most of which you'll see year in and year out. But the number one problem is sclerotinia stem rot. It's a disease that we see across the province, and it generally is the one that reaches the highest level of economic damage. A rough rule of thumb is that if you've got 30% sclerotinia infection in your crop, and you've got a lot of main stem or main branch infections, that you're going to lose about half that amount, 15% in terms of yield. So it's sort of a 2-to-1 ratio there. So this is a disease that deserves a lot of respect. At this time of year, of course, it's too late to do anything about it. This has to be sprayed for at the early blossom stage when we want to protect the blossoms with a fungicide application, because it's those blossoms, as they die and they fall down and lodge in the branches, that's where the sclerotinia organism likes to infect. It produces sort of a very small spore called an ascospore that germinates and grows on those dead blossoms. And if it's lodged in the axil of the branch here, then the fungus infects the blossom, and from there it can grow into the stem. The spores themselves, landing on a green stem or leaf, cannot infect directly. They need sort of an initial food substrate, which is usually the blossoms. That's why there's blossom or petal test kits for sclerotinia that you can buy from Discovery Seed Labs in Saskatoon, where you go out and you pluck blossoms or you gather dead blossoms or live blossoms off the plant. You actually plate them out yourself. They provide you with the agar plates and with a guide on how to recognize the sclerotinia fungus. And within a few days, you can count the number of petals that are colonized with it as a measure of your sclerotinia risk. The Canola Council of Canada, by the way, has an excellent array of scouting guides and information on diseases of canola. I didn't bring any along with me today. Just log on to their website, download it, or contact your area Canola Council agronomist. They'll be glad to top you up with really nice color brochures and that sort of thing. So the sclerotinia is reaching its peak right now, and as I mentioned, although it's too late to do anything about it, this is actually a good time to take note of the diseases you have in your crops, not only with your canola but your other crops as well, because they're very prominent. You can see them, and make note of those, because next year as you're planning your crop options, knowing the history of the diseases in your field is important. Some people or growers will even go to the point of marking the GPS coordinates of hot spots of disease in their fields. For example, some of the growers in central Alberta where they're battling clubroot, if they have a hot spot in the field, they'll actually mark that and go back in later after the crop is off and lime that area to bring the pH up, which is unfavorable for the clubroot organism. Or they'll lime the entrance to the field where the disease is often introduced. So having a GPS device with you is good for scouting as well. So for sclerotinia, we're generally monitoring for this disease. We'll start to see the symptoms shortly after blossoming usually, and then they just develop from there on. And when you get main stem infections, as you have here with the lesion down low, then the whole plant will usually die. Whereas in other cases like this one here, where you've got a single branch infection, then that's of course less serious than a main stem infection. So when you see these sclerotinia risk assessment guides, they will rate the potential for yield loss lower when you have infections like this versus infections like this on the scouting guides. Okay? Sclerotinia goes to many other crops as well, broadleaf crops especially, and we will talk about those when we come to the pulses. Farming Smarter is doing a project with the Pest Management Center in Ottawa where they're looking at two biological fungicides, Contans, which is incorporated into the soil and it attacks the sclerotian. It's usually used, applied in advance of planting a susceptible crop. And then there's another product called Serenade, which is a foliar applied product, and they're evaluating those two products as part of integrated disease management systems in canola and dry beans. And I'm sure Christina would love to share some of the results of that work if you're interested in knowing. All right, what are some of the other canola diseases that we're seeing at this time of the year? I don't know if that is looks pretty kind of small. I'd have to have a lens and look at. Dr. Mike Harding, one of my colleagues, is out in the canola fields right now, just trying to look at what diseases are out there and what their levels are as part of a provincial survey for canola diseases coordinated by Ralph Lang out of Vegreville. And talking to Mike this morning, he tells me he's seeing lots of sclerotinia, in some cases levels up to 30–40% of the plants in some fields with the disease. So that's getting up into the economic range for sure. Seeing a little bit of blackleg, another fungal disease that causes stem cankers. It's been increasing in incidence primarily, I think, because of the shorter rotations in recent years, and we're seeing some of that too. And it's the basal stem cankers that will kill the plant, much like this sclerotinia plant here. But Mike was saying the levels of blackleg that he's seeing are fairly low, indicating probably that growers are using varieties with genetic resistance as a means of managing that disease. Another disease that we're seeing this year, at this time of year especially, is aster yellows. You got that aster yellows plant there?
Can blackleg be pretty economically damaging?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. It sure can be economically damaging. Back in the 70s, we were watching the epidemics of blackleg in Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan. They were causing millions of dollars of loss, and the disease was sort of sweeping across to the west. We put legislation in place to declare it a pest under our Ag Pests Act, and we had a very active seed testing program for a couple of years and doing a lot of extension to try and keep that disease and the levels of damage down, and I think we succeeded, but it too can be very devastating. It attacks the seedlings at the cotyledon stage and then right through the green vegetative stage, so it's a disease that stays with you through the season, and it survives 2 or 3 years on the infected stubble, so it will continue to release spores that can cause infections even up to 3 years after the initial.
And that's also airborne too, then, right?
Yes, yeah. It's there are 2 spore stages. There's one that overwinters on the stubble, and it produces a long, narrow spore that's forcibly discharged, and it gets up into the wind, and it's the one that can be spread many kilometers. And there's another spore stage called the pycnidial stage that forms on the cotyledons initially and then on the leaves, and it goes through several spore production cycles during the growing season, and those spores are actually produced in a little flask-like structure called a pycnidium, which has a hole in the top, and when the humidity is high, the spores inside swell and they kind of squeeze out of the top like toothpaste, and they end up in a little pinkish coil, And all it takes is for a raindrop or something to hit that, and it'll disperse those spores, and they will reinfect leaves and so on that the spores end up on. So yeah, it's a bad disease. Okay, aster yellows. This is what aster yellows does to canola, and it is a mycoplasma or a phytoplasma organism that has hundreds of hosts. Most are broadleaf hosts, but it will also attack grasses and cereals. And what it does is it's initially carried to the crop, usually with leaf hoppers. And these leaf hoppers acquire the phytoplasma when they feed on an infected plant, and they'll retain that for a long time. And as they successively feed, they reintroduce the pathogen into the host. And leaf hoppers are fussy feeders. They will land on a plant and they'll probe it with their mouthpiece, and if they don't like it, then they fly off to another plant. And once they find something they like, they'll stay there for a while. But it's that act of probing and feeding that is sufficient to introduce the phytoplasma, which goes systemic in the plant and generally affects the flowering structures. And what happens is they end up turning into swollen bladder-like structures instead of pods, and of course there's no seed production. You can see here on this shoot that none of the pods develop to the point where they're going to produce seed. Mike was saying he's seeing about 10 or 20% aster yellows in some fields. In the eastern prairies in Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan, it's been much more serious than that. Levels 50 to 60% of plants in some fields infected, and there's of course a resulting yield loss from that. And the reason it seems to be worse this year is that usually the disease comes in with leafhopper flights. Leafhoppers overwinter in the southern U.S., in the plain, in Oklahoma typically, and they move northward as the crops get planted, and they eventually end up in southern Canada. And this year in Manitoba, they were already picking up heavy flights of leafhoppers in May. And these leafhoppers had the phytoplasma with them, so crops got infected at an early stage, and when that happens, there's more time for the pathogen to reproduce, therefore more impact on the plant. So they're seeing very high levels in canola. They're seeing high levels in other crops as well. Potatoes, for example, it causes a disease called purple top, which is very, very devastating. Where numbers warrant, people will spray for the leaf hoppers. That's about the only way to prevent the plants from getting infected, and you may need multiple applications. If you're a carrot grower, for example, in southern Manitoba, you're probably spraying for aster yellows every week to 10 days when the migrating leafhoppers, so you could be making 6-8 applications of insecticide just to keep the leafhoppers off your carrots. If it gets onto your carrots, then the roots develop rows of hair-like roots. You've probably seen this in your garden, and they're very bitter tasting, so it's a death knell to a processing or fresh market carrot grower to have aster yellows. Attacks lettuce and celery, members of the umbelliferae, the carrot family. So very, very devastating disease. This year, I don't think anybody sprayed for the leafhoppers, probably because you really have to be out there actively scouting with a sweep net. The leafhoppers are small, they're greenish white, and you need to be sweeping the crop and looking at levels, and you have to spray preventatively for leafhopper control. Once they're in your crop, they've probably transmitted the phytoplasma, and there's nothing that you can apply to plants like this to cure the infection. So that's aster yellows. You can pass that one around. Some